of democracy. Equality, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. All these things are inscribed as promises within democracy. Democracy is a promise. That is why it is a more historical concept of the political, the only concept of a regime or a political organisation in which history, that is to say the endless process of improvement and perfectibility, is inscribed in the concept. So it's a historical concept through and through, and that's why I call it to come, democracy to come. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Simon. Bonnie, if I could just invite you to address the, just to remind, is democracy overrated?
I asked Isabel to let me come last because I didn't actually know what I was going to say. First thing I was going to say, when I experience democracy, I'll let you know if it's overrated. And I'm glad that Simon ended with Derrida because, of course, he's absolutely right. Democracy is an aspiration, it is a dream. It is the highest dream of humankind, and it is where we aspire to be, but we don't quite have it. When I became a citizen of this country, I don't know how many people in this room have ever taken the oath of allegiance, but to become a citizen of the United Kingdom, you are invited to take the oath of allegiance. That is what you are told. As an American, I was absolutely appalled. I went to do this because I wanted to be and want to be a citizen of this country, very proud to be. But I hesitated for about a moment because to become a citizen, you have to pledge allegiance to the Queen and her heirs, not to you, not to the flag, not to the country of Wales or to Ale or to be. It's to her and her family. Now, where I come from, that wouldn't make this a democracy at all. And say if you lived in Switzerland, where I come from, wouldn't make the United States a democracy because, as a lot of Americans found out in George Bush's second term, you don't directly elect the President of the United States. You elect the Electoral College, which is an oligarchy, and that elects the President of the United States. A lot of people were shocked. So I'll just close by saying, and want to lay this provocation out, is that, you know, the question of this country as a democracy in the way that I understand democracy, I would say no. In the way that maybe a Chinese person might understand democracy, she may say yes. So it is a dream, and it is an aspiration, and is it overrated? No. When we attain it, we'll know that it's not. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say in defense of the Queen and apropos Robin's observation, she is very short. So
she's about my height.
Well, maybe you shouldn't run for president. No. So, all right, we've had lots of comments on the flaws and failings and a vision of the perfectibility of democracy. But I'd like to kind of go back and again perhaps ask Robin whether we think that democracy is kind of intrinsically better, that even with all its flaws, which you outlined, and with, in a sense, this kind of mockery of choice, which you outlined, if the choice were between accepting an oligarchy as a good thing, calling for it, as it were, on Tahrir Square, would you say that was a more honest system and one that was likely to serve us better?
In the end, I have to think that democracy in some form is about the best we could do. But on the other side of the coin, my reflection kind of as an academic and having been in several universities, that the best kind of administration you can have is an enlightened autocracy, because what it means is nobody else has to worry about all this administrative rubbish that bedevils us and probably bedevils everybody in government ministries and business, never mind the universities. But the problem is, to be an enlightened autocracy, you have to have somebody who has your interests as a department, or in the equivalent case, the country at stake. And the great difficulty with that inevitably is You know, once you give people a taste of power, they pursue it for their own ends rather than the greater good. So I worry that, you know, democracy and autocracy maybe actually aren't too different from each other in one sense, but probably the best we can do is to have a point where people, at least in some form, can vote governments out. But the danger is, you know, always, and I suppose history has shown this, you know, power blocks can always take over and remove that democracy if they want, and that's our worry.
So that's a qualified defence of oligarchy, I would say, at best.
Yes.
I mean, who ensures the enlightenment
Yes.
of the enlightened autocracy?
Well, I guess that's my point. I think is the only way you can have some defence against that is to have the standard democratic voting system as we have it in the West. Anyway, at least you have an opportunity to vote people out if you think they're doing a bad job, even if it's an illusion.
David, I wanted to come back to you because after you spoke, there was quite a lot of, we heard people sort of taking the flaws of democracy, you know, putting them full frontal, and Bonnie said, well, we don't live in one anyway. Mm-hmm. Would you like to respond?
She would certainly know about it if we didn't. Let's suppose that we were living in a country which we can genuinely and easily describe as not being a democracy. Let's take one at random, North Korea. Let us imagine, well, and there may be a number of others, maybe Tunisia, as it was before Ben Ali fell. Let us imagine that somebody like Hilary Lawson wishes to start up a philosophy festival. And he says, what I would like to do is I'd like to invite a number of people, and one of the subjects they should discuss is the present government useless? What is the first thing that will happen? The first thing that will happen is that somebody will suggest to him that maybe this isn't such a good idea. He shouldn't kind of go ahead with it. It would be a bad idea. But he decides that he will do anyway. The next thing that happens is the people he invite say, please don't invite me again. It's going to be a bit of a problem where I've got a job. I don't want to be associated with it. So people then don't turn up. Maybe he hires a venue, but the venue person who's hiring out the venue is told discreetly by the local block leader or whoever it is keeps an eye on the logo that maybe it would be a good idea for the thing not to happen. And the net result is, in a non-democracy, which you can recognise by the absence of such features, is that you don't have a discussion like this. You know, in other words, when you're living in something that it is not. One of the things that was really interesting about the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions was the spirit which came out of them was one of ending humiliation. It goes back to the point about enlightened autocracy, and also to a point that Sam and I were discussing earlier about the LSE's talking to Colonel Gaddafi. And this is the delusion that people in democracies often have about the nature of power. There's a wonderful moment in Anthony Giddens' interview in 2005 with Gaddafi, where he talks about how Gaddafi is listening very seriously, he thinks, to what Anthony Giddens has to say, and how he is contemplating very seriously the possibility of a greater democratisation. And then you look, just kind of accidentally through history, I mean, we'll talk about the height thing later and the symmetry thing later, and so on, and what you notice is that the thing that is famous about Sulla, the Roman dictator, the one thing you know about him, the one thing that makes Sulla stand out is he's the one dictator that leaves voluntarily, because all the others find an excuse not to go. In other words, autocracy can never in the end be enlightened because it is autocracy. There is never a moment when it admits itself to be unenlightened and therefore necessarily has to depart.
But I want to bring this back home because it's easy to go to some grand mal horror like North Korea. Of course, this is a democracy in relation to North Korea. There's no question about it. But as I'm saying, as a foreigner who's lived in another kind of democracy, there are aspects of this country that are, for me, undemocratic. And I would invite people to actually, for instance, the average British person knows nothing about how Parliament works, how the head of state works, what le reine le vote, what the Parliament Act means, all of these things, because in an oligarchy, in a monarchy, it is not necessary for you to know these answers because you cannot affect the outcome of whatever this is about. This is the situation we are in. And it's interesting because what Alex Salmond is talking about in Scotland, everybody can laugh about and whatever, but there's going to be an enormous pressure on this union in the years to come. And unless we in the United Kingdom understand the democracy we live in and not flee and sort of compare ourselves and beat our chests and be happy about the fact that we're not North Koreans. I mean, you know, I understand what David is saying. He's absolutely right. But I'm concerned about how this nation, our nation, functions now with all the pressures that are being pushed on the union itself in relation to democracy. And we just need to understand that in comparison, we don't elect our head of state, and therefore that movement goes all the way down into creating oligarchies in our BBC and in business and everywhere else, where that head of state and that process is replicated all the way through society, even to your garden society in your community. If you look at it, you can see it replicate itself in every way. It takes an enormous amount of energy out of a people when they are not allowed to participate, when they are not allowed to penetrate the government that rules over them. This isn't government by the people.
But would you say, for instance, that this was a particular characteristic of the British Constitution, or that monarchy inevitably, I mean, after all, there are some small social democracies in Europe that have monarchies, Sweden, Holland. Would you say it was the same issue there, or is it peculiar to Britain?
Monarchy is probably the most immature form of government that any mature people can have. You think about it for a second. Every government, I mean, this is a very smart monarchy because because you have fashioned this monarchy into your own image. It is not an hereditary monarchy, for instance. So the Queen, when she passes, Charles is in line, but it doesn't mean he's going to be the king. It depends. If Parliament doesn't want that to happen, it won't happen, and it has happened. This has happened before. So I would say monarchy is something that should be off the table for any democracy.
Well, I'd like to remind ourselves that we don't live in a monarchy. I mean, we've got a constitutional monarchy, but we don't live in a monarchy in the sense of the monarch being sovereign. While I agree with Bonnie saying that there are aspects of our democracy which are undemocratic, I think my argument was that this belongs to democracy, and it's a very important feature. And to say we haven't attained it yet, that's inside democracy. So the mistake is to think we've got some dream ideal which we could reach and then we'll really have achieved democracy. When you say we don't quite have it, that's the democratic impulse, and that's what you need to keep hold of, that you want that to be a permanent feature. The idea of reaching an end is precisely what we don't want. Now this, for me, relates to the sense in that, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a sense in which democracy is a philosophical idea, and it's the idea of holding open the question of how to live. There are two ways one can think about that question, how to live, how should we live. One is to think that you, as it were, have the answer, and the thing is to move along the road to that end, and then you're done, it's closed, and you now know finally how to live. Or alternatively, your way of living should be one which precisely holds open the question rather than closing it. This is why democracy, in the sorts of terms that David was talking about, the possibility of critique, which is never given up, it's absolutely sustained, is inside the democratic organisation rather than, as it were, just a means to an end. Absolutely. And so I'd like to see the idea of how to live as something that is kept alive and not closed, and that this, as it were, is opening up the democracy to come, to remain to come.
Robin, I'd just like to pick up on some things you said earlier and sort of think about the question of what we want our government to do for us. I mean, we have in Western democracies seen a transfer of wealth upwards to increasingly, you know, a small group, and inequality has been growing. Not something you'd expect a democracy to produce, where you would expect at least a kind of token greatest prosperity for the greatest number. We've seen it in the United States, we've seen it here. Bonny attributes our, I think, fair to say, intrinsic oligarchy to the existence of the monarchy, but surely other systems